Okay, well, before I jump into hand sanding those blades, let's talk for just a few minutes about stock removal versus forging a blade. Well, as you're probably aware, it's an age-old debate, and you can find people on both sides of it. You can find people who say that if you're forging a blade, you're ruining the steel, depending on the type of steel particularly. You can find people that say if you're just grinding a piece of steel to shape, you're not, creating a blade that's as good as forging a blade is. So you can find both extremes. And my experience and my study, the answer to the question of which is better, stock removal or forging, is yes. So there you go. Really though, here's what it comes down to. It comes down to the processes to make a stock removal versus a forged blade are not too terribly different, but depending on which way you do it, you need to do it right for that way, if that makes sense. And so it really comes down to more to who's making the blade, if they are employing the proper or adequate processes for the chosen means or method of making a knife. For example, I think sometimes an adequate or proper regimen of heat treating can be overlooked, or sometimes is overlooked in stock removal. And that deals with the state in which you get your steel most of the time these days is spheroidized or spheroidal annealing or spheroidal annealed steel. And in order for the steel to reach its full potential, there's often heat treating steps that need to be done that I don't think are oftentimes on stock removal blades. And if you're forging that same steel, it sort of by default, some of that's already happening. That's content for another video, which I'm kind of excited to delve into here in a while. But suffice to say, you can make a very good blade with either method. Conversely, for example, with forging a blade, in some ways that requires more knowledge and skill to make a good blade. The end result can be a better blade, but it can also be easier to ruin a blade depending on what type of steel you're using and how you do it. So, I mean, this isn't really a full-orbed answer because I don't have time for that, but the point is, it really has a lot more to do with the maker or the bladesmith than it does the particular process. There's multiple ways to get the job done. When it comes down to the actual process of forging a blade, does that make the steel better? Again, not by default, however it can. And again, that's probably not the answer most people are looking for, but that's just the facts, that's just the truth, that's my experience. There's not a lot we're necessarily changing in the forging of the steel. There's the whole debate about packing the steel when it forging at a lower temperature to compress things and that kind of stuff. And according to some, that's metallurgically debunked. And for modern steels, I think that's probably true. But it was definitely, you can go back in the old blacksmithing books and that kind of thing, and that was a technique that was used. But they were working with very different, well, not very different, but significantly different materials. That the steel that they had available to them, by and large, was much more varied in quality and more crude, more impure, this kind of thing. So some of the techniques that were well used and even necessary to a superior product don't necessarily carry over. And for example, if you try to pack, as it were, forge at a lower temperature on some steels, you'll completely ruin them, like O1 for example. So let's talk about that for a minute. O1 tool steel, very good steel. That's what I'm making these Wilderness Special blades out of. It's one of my, if not the favorite steel for stock removal blades. But it does not forge well. You have to be extremely careful to keep it at the proper forging temperature. Even if you just go a little bit low, in my experience, if you go just a little bit below your forging temperature and you hit it, you will end up with a microfracture or hidden crack that will reveal itself at the most inopportune time later. In other words, your blade will just pop in half. Now, you can forge 1080, 1095, 1520, things like that at the same temperature and be fine all day long. Very different. So there's a lot of different facets to this. If I knew, or if there was a superior means of making a knife, as in, forging was superior to stock removal or vice versa, then by default I would have to use the most superior method, because I'm trying to make the best tool that I can. And there is no, they're different, and they both yield excellent results if done properly. So that's the explanation as best I can give it in a short amount of time. Now, me personally, I like forging. One of the reasons I really like forging is because of the different things you can do, like the laminate steels, the Sanmai, the Damascus. I love all that stuff. And I have made lots and lots of stock removal knives and lots of forged knives. And I'm at the point, if you've watched the channel at all, you've probably heard me say this a couple times in other videos, I'm at the point where I want to move more towards forged blades and more unique, special, fewer pieces, instead of a whole bunch of the stock removal blades that I've made a lot of and it's paid the bills, and a lot of people are out there using those knives and will for years and years to come, and that's great. And I've also thought, because there is a purpose and a demand for these knives and ones like them that I've made. And so I've actually kind of thought, the idea of making some runs of knives, as it were, just bouncing that idea around in my head a little bit, instead of taking orders and having orders coming in from all the time. We're making a run of 10, 15, whatever, knives of a specific model that has proven to be, well loved in the past. I don't know, it's just an idea, but for the most part, so forging. It's just the things you can do with forging that you can't do with stock removal are really cool, okay? So I'll just, leave it at that. And there's also the nostalgic bit to it, which I think is valuable. That has value. Back in the day, 150, 200 years ago, people didn't grind knives out. That's not how you made it. That's not how you made a blade, And if they could have, would they have? I'm sure some of them would have, for sure. But the steel they had available to them was, like I said a minute ago, rough, raw, in shapes that really weren't conducive to making a blade, or much of anything else for that matter, which is why you have to forge it out and make what you need to make. So just simply grinding a blade out of stock is definitely a product of the matured industrial era, in which we have ready supply of dimensional steel stock that we can easily get a hold of, and a lot of the work, as it were, is already done. You're not starting out with a 4x2x2 chunk of steel where you have to forge it out into something that can even remotely resemble a blade. You can already get it in 1/8 inch, 3/16, whatever. So there's that. I will point out, though, that I think it's funny sometimes how, here's an example. Let's say you're making a beautiful piece of mosaic Damascus, in which you do all kinds of different forge welding processes and procedures to create a specific pattern in the blade, okay, or in the piece of steel, I should say. And you forge it out, get it to dimension, much like a piece of bar stock. Now, at that point, if you go and then forge the shape of the knife and forge in the bevel and do the whole forging process on the blade, you will greatly distort, if not just destroy, that intricate and beautiful pattern that you've spent all that time creating. And so essentially you have just created a piece of bar stock, and then you literally just make a bar stock or a stock removal blade out of it. Is that blade forged or is it stock removal? You know, and the answer again is yes. So, you know, there's a lot of different elements to this, and the goal is to make the best knife, the best tool that we can make, and there's different ways of going about that and different, you know, specific elements to that. And so, you know, San Mai is another example. You know, when you're forging a piece of San Mai, you have to have your 3 layers of steel have to be consistent. Otherwise, if you go to finish the blade, you have the jacket way high on one side and all wonky and stuff like that. So in that case, you're basically just forging another piece of tri-metal bar stock and grinding the knife out of it. So again, you're utilizing the processes necessary to get the product that you're after. So that's kind of my 2.5 cents on the whole thing.